The Controlled Environment Ag Center is an interdisciplinary group of faculty, staff, and students working in controlled environments and looking into the future to bring more food to a hungry world. And to do that using resources more efficiently, improving quality, and, of course, increasing productivity. Our event today is to cap off our summer activities as well as the past 6 months or so activities of our students, faculty, and staff to make presentations to us, to get together, to talk, to share information. But today we have a very special opportunity with a unique, interesting, worldly guest speaker, Dr. Fedoroff, who will be introduced shortly. We're really pleased that you could be here. We also have the opportunity after we're finished, and I invite you to stay for some fresh food that was prepared by local chefs, and they will be introduced later on as well. And these products were grown in the greenhouse in controlled environments, and we expect that they will be just superior. At this point, I would like to move on to Dr. Mark Riley, who is the head of the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department, College of Agriculture and Life Sciences here at the University of Arizona. Mark, would you like to say a few words, please?
Thank you, Gene. It's truly an honor to be here today and to participate in this wonderful event. I think it's going to be very stimulating and very interesting for you all to see some of the fantastic activities that are going on in controlled environment agriculture. So this field of controlled environment agriculture has a long history on the campus of the University of Arizona. And given our environment, one can see that there's some very good reasons to be doing this kind of work here. So the activities in controlled environment ag really coalesced and took a major step forward around 1998 when there was state appropriations from the state of Arizona that led to the development of this wonderful center. So the funds were used to be able to build facilities, to hire faculty, and for operating expenses to keep the operations moving forward. So as part of the center here, we have 2 faculty in my department, Agricultural Biosystems Engineering. Dr. Gene Giacomelli mentioned it. Dr. Marat Bashir, who's sitting over there, is also a member in our department. We're also our faculty in the School of Plant Sciences, Dr. Cherry Kubota and Dr. Pat Morabach. And I think it's something of a unique situation that we have here. People often talk about interdisciplinary work. And I think what happens here is a little different than interdisciplinary work. Because we have engineers who understand the horticulture. We have horticulturalists and plant scientists who understand the engineering. So it's not like getting 2 people from completely different sides of the road. It's getting people who understand very intimately what the other groups are trying to do. So what that allows us to do is some really unique things. We can have an understanding of the plant itself, the plant physiology and the response to the environment, and connect that with engineering systems, with sensors and controls and operating approaches that truly integrate what it is the plant needs and to guide the plants in the directions that we would like it to go. So I think it goes beyond interdisciplinary work. It's this true partnership amongst the faculty and amongst the departments and amongst partners in industry and abroad. So there's some tremendous things that are going on in the center. We're truly pleased to have this as an important part of our departments, an important part of the College of Agriculture. So thank you very much for coming today and your attention, and enjoy the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Now I'd like to introduce Michael Monday, who will then say a few words and then introduce our guest speakers.
Thank you, Gene. I'm going to keep the table because I have to look at paper. But you've already looked at paper, and that's this amazing description of Dr. Fedoroff. I should talk about how I'm here. Desert Rain Research and Communication and our sister publication, the Tech News Frontiers, has been doing stories on the control of agriculture center and also video stories for about 3 years now. And we're very interested in what they're doing, both with agricultural biological engineering and also with plant sciences. When we learned some months ago that Fedoroff was going to be coming to Tucson to talk about the potential for a project at CEAC, we were very interested. Because as you know, Dr. Fedoroff is one of the leading scientists in biotechnology and also in food production. Particularly over the last 15 years, her voice has been heard rather strongly in many public forums about the need and the ways that we have at our disposal to feed the world. To feed the world. To feed the world. That's Dr. Fedoroff. Feeding the world. In any event, her scientific background is extraordinary, as you well know. But I learned some other things about Dr. Fedoroff, which I think are just dynamite too. Her first job was as a translator from Russian to English. Now, with a name like Fedoroff, that's not surprising either. But then she was also a professional flautist. She played the flute in the Syracuse Symphony. My goodness, this is art of high order. She was a good flautist. That's what people have said. There were little things I read. In any event, that might surprise us. The other thing that I found out last night at dinner was that she has a passion for the tango. Well, that makes a certain kind of sense, particularly because of her description of what the tango is. The tango is a precise dance, she says. It only appears to be seductive, but it's really very exhilarating. And that seems to me something that I've heard from scientists before. In their pursuit of science, when they find something out, they become very exhilarating. And the thing that I am struck by with Dr. Fedoroff is not just her extraordinary career in science, but that hers is an intelligence of great humanity as well as scientific depth. And like all great scientists, there is great art in the doing. So, without any further ado, let me ask Dr. Fedoroff to please come up here and give us some art. She's double-minded.
Well, that was somewhere between the most embarrassing and the most profound introduction I've ever experienced. So.
We're not sure yet.
I hope that what follows isn't disappointing. So here's the title that I've been given by Dr. Giacomelli. There we go.
Oh, no, don't blame me.
I'm not to blame him. It's all right. Mine was not so very different. But let me start with something that's happened to me this year. In early January this year, I got a note from Andy Refkin. Does anybody follow .Earth blog on the New York Times? One person. I recommend it highly. It's very interesting. And what he said is, I'm trying to make sense of this, meaning the FAO Food Price Index, for my Times.Earth readers, and you can help by providing your perspective. Is this a reflection of the true limits to resources that Paul Krugman has been inching toward in the last couple of years with climate extremes. This guy's very articulate. With climate extremes, essentially waves lapping over the gunwales of a leaking boat? Or is this likely to be another temporary slosh in the uneven pulses of demand, supply, and variegated conditions, steadily creating more pressure for productivity, which is eventually provided? Or will it never be possible to know the difference until it's essentially too late? Well, you will remember that in 2008 we had a food price crisis, and that's evident here. And lots of people said, gee, that's just another bump in the road. And of course, food prices came down. But here we are in 2010, and we're back up at the top. And so my answer to Revkin was this. I don't have a crystal ball. But the fact of the matter is that the pressures on our food supply have never been greater. And as we all know, a lot of money is now going into biofuels research. And then there's climate change. We'll come to each of these. But let's start where we are. So this was at the beginning of 2011. And this is what's been happening in 2011. Things are staying right up there. But of course, concerns about what we now call food security, are as old as mankind. In modern times, and that means the past few hundred years, it was Thomas Malthus that framed it so well that the paradox so well that Malthusian has become a word in our language that denotes a food scarcity-based crisis. And of course, what he pointed out is that our ability to produce food tends to grow at a linear rate, whereas the population grows exponentially. Now, the thing that people don't appreciate is that just about the same time that he was writing, science began to enter agriculture in a big way. It really dates back to Joseph Priestley, who figured out that plants give off oxygen by keeping a mouse alive in a sealed jar with a plant. That was followed very quickly, and in the pantheon of discoverers of what it is that plants actually need chemically is Evan Pugh, and the Evan Pugh professorship at Penn State is one that I hold with great pride. He was part of figuring out that plants could use nitrogen in an inorganic form. They didn't need organic form. And that began a huge revolution. Fast forward to the 20th century, nitrogen was supplied in all kinds of ways in the late 19th century. Those of you who know the history of fertilizer know that we discovered that manure of all kinds, including bird manure, was a very good source of fertilizer, and there were deposits of bird manure on islands that got excavated very rapidly. It was a resource that was run through in a matter of decades. It wasn't until the early 20th century that these two gentlemen, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, figured out how to pull nitrogen out of the air. And of course, today it's produced in huge plants around the world, and that's just an example of one of them. Now, curiously enough, that process hasn't changed in a century, and that's one of the challenges going forward because, of course, the production of fertilizer is quite energy intensive. Another dimension that Malthus couldn't have foreseen is the mechanization of agriculture. And of course, no matter where you go in the world, but not in places, many places in Africa. It's quite mechanized, and the most sophisticated precision agriculture is increasingly done with driverless tractors, and it's a modern model of modernity and automation. But now let's talk about plants. Long before the 20th century, people were changing plants to make them more useful for agriculture. This is the wild progenitor of our modern corn plant. They're so different from each other that they were originally assigned to different species. So on the upper left is a plant called teosinte, and this is the modern ear of corn. Teosinte makes its seeds at the top, and they are literally hard as rock. Later in the 20th century, it was discovered in the 20s that these two plants can actually cross-fertilize, and you get progeny that look everything like the rachis of the teosinte plant with its silica-containing rock-hard seeds to things that are recognizably ears of corn. Now, just a tidbit that might be of interest is that long before trains and planes and buses, the early progenitors of corn, which looked much like this little tiny ear, spread with incredible speed. Once the mutations that converted teosinte to maize happened and were gathered together in single plants, they sped northward from their origins in Mexico and had penetrated within a few thousand years into southern United States, this area. And that's a remarkable rate of spreading. So people knew that they had created something extraordinary. But this is, oops, went backwards. This is what happened in the 20th century. And again, that has an interesting story behind it. There was a man by the name of George Harrison Shull who had become a staff scientist at the Carnegie Institution of Washington's experimental station at Cold Spring Harbor. This is long before the famous Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And his director had asked him to put on a demonstration of these newly rediscovered Mendelian principles, and instead of using peas, as Mendel had, he got himself some corn from his father-in-law's farm and some local corn, and he inbred them because he kind of got curious about why there were different numbers of rows. Not a research project that probably would get funded from NSF today. But it led to a revolution. So, as you all know, inbreeding rather makes for puny plants. But to his surprise, when he crossed these rather puny plants, he got big, uniform plants with much bigger ears. And that's the origin of our contemporary hybrid corn, which is so extraordinarily productive. Now, people, the stories are not quite as tidy, but people have done the same with wheat and rice. So today, the productivity of our crops is enormously enhanced. So when people worry about GMOs, this is what I try to remind them, that genetic modification has a very, very long history. Well, when Malthus wrote his essay, the world population was down here around 1 billion. All of these advances that I'm telling you about, which happened rather more continuously and less dramatically than in retelling, permitted a tripling of the world population by the middle of the 20th century. And of course, the next doubling happened very fast by the end of the century. That's a remarkable story of agricultural success. But of course, it's come at a huge price. Peter Raven was the director of the Missouri Botanical Garden until recently, and is an indefatigable champion of biodiversity. And what he says is that nothing has driven more species to extinction or caused more instability in the world's ecological systems than the development of an agriculture sufficient to feed 6.3 billion people. You can see that the quotations quite hold by this time. We're at 7 billion now. But of course, what's happened is the planet's forests and prairies have given way year by year, decade by decade, to much simpler agricultural ecosystems virtually everywhere in the world. Complex ecosystems have been replaced by monocultures, often irrigated from fossil aquifers. That's water pumped from the ground that isn't replaced. That's where we are today. The loss of biodiversity is already at catastrophic levels and continues to accelerate. Now, of course, it's not confined to land. The overuse of fertilizers has resulted in the eutrophication of rivers and coastal seawater, making areas of our coastal oceans uninhabitable for the fish that we so value. Now, the population pundits are telling us that by the middle of the century, which doesn't look so far away anymore, we will have added somewhere between 1 billion and 3 billion people to the population. That's a daunting prospect. Here's a factoid that you might not be aware of, and that is that the amount of arable land, the land that we now define as arable, hasn't changed in more than half a century. And what that means is that the amount of arable land per person has decreased by half. That looks like on the left, it looks like a big increase, but it's only 10%. And now, of course, people are talking about biofuels. And then there's global climate change. Let me briefly draw your attention to this little X. That's the hot summer in Europe of 2003. And that is what I would say is a harbinger of things to come. Everybody read in the newspapers about the 30 to 50,000 people that died in that heat wave. But what we didn't hear about was the 20 to 35% decrease in crop yields. That's pretty impressive. Now, look at this. If the climate gurus are right, that's going to be an average summer by 2050. And by the end of the century, it's going to be a cool summer. That's pretty scary. So 2010 wasn't very kind. Russia lost, what, about 40% of its crop, its wheat crop, something like that. Pakistan had a double whammy. It had unprecedented heat, which devastated its wheat crop, and of course the floods that were unprecedented. I think that was a freak year, but here we are again. The locations are different. Is this climate change? The climate scientists are always reluctant to conclude that this is climate change from even 2 years in a row of harsh climatological events. Nonetheless, this is exactly what they predict. More heat, more drought in some places, more energy in the system, more water in other places. Now, crop yields decline with increasing temperature for several reasons. And an important one is that photosynthesis, the optimum for photosynthesis for our big crops, which evolved in a climate we've now left behind, is about 25 degrees centigrade. And this is what you can see. You don't need to see the details. Corn, soybeans, cotton, this is 25 degrees. And you can see that the cotton is a little more tolerant than soybeans and so forth. But this is the problem. And then there's water scarcity. The circles, the red circles denote the areas where there will be increasing water scarcity as time goes by. Not a pretty picture. Is it happening already? This is a paper that's already out. This was a preprint of it by David Lobel and his co-authors. One of the first, the integration of climate science and predictions of what it's going to mean on a more fine-grained level than a global level is really quite new. The early papers go back to just 2008, 2009. But these are the results for the most sophisticated analysis of the impact of climate on crops since 1980. You can see that it's negative, and the negative impact is likely to grow. So what are the tasks that are before us in the 20th century, even if we make the most optimistic predictions about the rate of population growth? We all want more sustainable agriculture. That means decreasing agriculture's ecological footprint. We need to reduce its pollution of air, land, and water, decrease its demand for fresh water, and adapt crops to a hotter and drier world. And oh, by the way, double the food supply by 2050. Pretty daunting undertaking. Can we do it? Well, I would say that just in the nick of time, we've had another revolution in the 20th century, and that's the molecular revolution. That's the good news. This is a very familiar example of what is now called a genetically modified crop, as if we had never modified crops before. They were all natural until these techniques came along, but I hope I've convinced you that that's not true. We've been at it for literally tens of thousands of years. This is corn that has been modified by the addition of a bacterial gene from Bacillus thuringiensis. It's often called the Bt gene, but it's a gene that encodes a toxin, a little protein, which is toxic to the larvae of some of the most important corn pests, including the European corn borer. But it's not toxic to people, and the reason it's not toxic to people or animals is because we simply don't have the receptor in our guts. It is only when that little protein encounters a receptor that it does damage, and it does damage only to the insects that actually consume it. So today it's possible to use these techniques to very precisely alter organisms. Mike didn't mention that I managed to get an op-ed piece on this in the New York Times.
This morning.
This morning.
This very morning.
This very morning.
And you had no hate mail?
No, I've had a couple of negative ones. I expected a flood of hate mail, but maybe the early ones are the positive ones. Every time I publish anything on this subject, I get a lot of hate mail. And frankly, I think that's a tragedy. The point of the editorial is that we've come to regulate these modifications as if they're dangerous, and we've been doing it for 25 years. We got stuck back in the 80s. I actually participated in all of this. I'm that much of an antique. It wasn't until the plant applications came along, there was a rather flexible process within the National Institutes of Health to look at the science as it developed and say, okay, now we've had enough experience with this particular application, we can stop regulating it. When the process was taken over by the regulatory agencies, which include the Environmental Protection Agency, the USDA Animal and Plant Health Protection Service, and the FDA, they came up with a set of regulations that was very conservative, and it's only gotten worse since then. the reason I wrote the editorial is simply because the EPA is now planning to expand its regulatory purview even more, make it even wider than it has been before. And by contrast, the evidence is pretty clear now that there isn't any damaging, any particular risks of damage that are unique to using these techniques. Indeed, the European Union has been investing in biosafety research for 25 years. They published a report summarizing there, and I'll come to that in a moment. But as you all probably are keenly aware, there's a lot of anti-GM sentiment. The US has managed to move forward despite the regulatory complexity, but there's a lot of anti-GMO sentiment here. In fact, when I gave a bunch of lectures in Santa Fe, which is kind of the hotbed of organic movement, they actually hired extra security guards for the evening. It was fine. One of the chief activists is this fellow Jose Bové, and this is an old picture of him pulling up GM corn. What they did recently, in my understanding that he was involved in it, was they pulled up a bunch of INRA experimental grape fields. So they had been working for years and years and years to develop grape strains that are resistant to many of the huge pathogens. And consequent on that event, INRA basically said, we're not going to do this kind of research anymore. What a tragedy. So we're back to chemicals. And particularly, a particularly poignant victim of this anti-GM sentiment is Africa. And this is a book that I recommend to everybody. Rob Parlberg has worked in this area for a very long time. And I'm just going to quote a little bit. There's a lot of material here in this book. But one of the things that he relates, is that in 2002, with drought in Zambia creating a dire need for international food aid, the president of Zambia, by the name of Mwanawasa, said, I'm not going to accept any food aid in the form of genetically modified corn, because it might be toxic and might threaten my citizens. Here, citizens are dying of starvation. But the reality of this is very different. It turns out that some of the president's buddies were growers of baby vegetables for the export market to England. And some of their customers called them up and said, you let genetically modified corn into the country for food aid, and you've lost us as customers. They leaned on the president, and the president said, doesn't come into the country. It's a dramatic story, but it's not unique. And today, what's happening in Africa is that bit by bit, Africa is saying, we need this. We have to take the risks in the export market. Now, South Africa has been growing GM crops for a long time. Burkina Faso is coming along. Kenya is coming along. Egypt has approved its first ones. But it's still a big, big problem worldwide. Fortunately, this is the report that I referred to earlier. This is the European Union's latest report on the last decade of its research on the biosafety of genetically modified organisms. And I've highlighted the one sentence that summarizes the entire report. The main conclusion to be drawn from the efforts of more than 130 research projects covering a period of more than 25 years of research and involving more than 500 independent research groups, is that biotechnology, and in particular GMOs, are not themselves, per se, more risky than conventional plant breeding technologies. And of course, every serious scientific body that's examined the issue has come to exactly the same conclusion. This is the rest of the quote that I started with when I was on the downward trajectory of my talk. To assert that GM techniques are a threat to biodiversity is to state the exact opposite of the truth. This is Mr. Biodiversity Champion himself. The less focused and productive the agriculture, the more destructive its effects. Too true. Well, the good news is that despite all of this public rejection and protests and so forth, GM crops have been adopted more rapidly than any crops in history. The current volume, the current acreage planted in GM crops has increased from 1996 to 2009, 2010 by about 2 orders of magnitude, 100-fold. GM crops are now being grown in 29 different countries on 148 million hectares. And the important statistic is this: 90% of the more than 15 million farmers who grow GM crops are smallholder, resource-poor farmers. This is scale-independent technology. It helps everybody. Unanticipated adverse effects. Anybody that's read in this field has encountered people worrying about, well, what's going to happen in 10 years or 15 years or so forth and so on. Well, it's now been about 35 years that we've been working with these techniques, and they've been in commercial production for almost 15 years. And the unexpected effects have all been benign so far. The first, most obvious thing is that pesticide poisoning has gone down. Now, that's not a problem for people who live in developed countries and use big air-conditioned tractors, but it is a problem in more of the world than it's not a problem. There are some 25 million cases of pesticide poisoning every year. And in areas, particularly in China, where they've done large-scale genetically modified rice trials and cotton trials, the incidence of pesticide poisoning has gone way down. That's a plus. That's a plus to the environment because pesticides do affect animals, unlike herbicides. But here's one of the most surprising, unanticipated effects. And that is that fungal toxin contamination of particularly the Fusarium ear rot toxin, fuminosins, are as much as somewhere in many studies have been done, is somewhere between 50 and 90% reduction in mycotoxins. These are really nasty compounds. They're carcinogenic. They kill animals. It's a major reason why lots of corn, in particular from particularly humid, high humidity areas, are thrown away. So that's a plus. But another plus, which has been documented now from India and China as well as the Midwest, is that areas where there's a lot of genetically modified insect-resistant crops, the pest pressure on surrounding fields, you might think that it would go up, but it goes down in the whole area. So actually, insecticide use is decreased outside of the fields that are planted in genetically modified crops. Now, what's the problem? Again, I've already referred to this. The problem is that after all these years, we're still tied up in this regulatory morass. Everybody's noticed that it's only the big crops, primarily feed and fiber crops, the soybeans, the corn, the canola, the cotton that are genetically modified. We've been hearing about golden rice for a decade, and it's not out there yet. Listening to Ingo Petrikis, who developed that rice, is listening to a man who's frustrated beyond belief. Vitamin A deficiency is a big problem. 20-odd years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation put together a conference and asked breeders if they could solve a problem just like that with biotechnology. What would that problem be, the problem that would reach the largest number of consumers and address the most important problem? They said vitamin A in rice. Well, it took 15 years, but they did it. And Ingo speaks with great passion. He said, we were ready to deliver it in 1998. They did violate a bunch of patents when they went to distribute it. The way patents work is that researchers can use the patented constructs and materials, but if they want to commercialize them, they can't. Syngenta, I believe it was. No, Bayer is the one that helped them get permission to distribute this freely to poor people everywhere. And for the last 10 years, it's been held up simply in endless rounds of more demands for more tests. It's really sad. This is something that we need to get through. So let's go back to the overall challenges and ask, where is the progress to be made? We need to increase tolerance to heat and drought, to flooding and salinity, to pests and diseases. We need to do it biologically. Many people don't appreciate that this is not largely done biologically today. We do need to increase crop productivity, nitrogen utilization efficiency, and the efficiency of photosynthesis. That's a big problem that, interestingly enough, it's the biofuels. The Department of Energy, which is funding biofuels development, is tackling that one head on, not the agriculture community. So that's where we need to go. And how do we do it without the most contemporary science? That's the paradox. But I think that we need to think we need to think in new ways. And of course, that's one of the reasons that I'm here. We need to begin to think about the entire system. So how do we do that? Well, I'm just going to give you, this is an area ripe for innovation. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Today, this is an example from a country that I'm starting to work in, Saudi Arabia. Until 2008, Saudi Arabia sought to be self-sufficient in wheat production, and this is how they grew it. They pumped water out of fossil aquifers to grow wheat, and they were wheat self-sufficient for 20 years, subsidized by the government. They discontinued that in 2008 because they realized that the aquifers were not bottomless. They weren't being recharged, and their population was growing. Unfortunately, it has not had the effect that they want of decreasing irrigated agriculture. What has happened is that the farmers have so far moved to higher value crops where they can still make money by irrigating them. So they have very great challenges in their water. Now, lest you think that this is a particularly Saudi folly, this is Colorado. It looks pretty much the same. For us, it's the Ogallala Aquifer. So that's one of the challenges. What are some of the answers? How do you irrigate more efficiently? This is a field in Israel, which is irrigated not by drip agriculture, which is the last generation, but actually pressurized hoses underground, minimizes, and fertigation simply means combining irrigation with fertilization. This is fertilized from a tank way back here in the background that you can barely see. This is a big field of actually polyploid canola. So those are some of the ways that water can be conserved. It is beginning to be more commonly used, but by far the previous slide represents the way the world does it today. Hydroponics. Again, this is, I think I'm bringing coals to Newcastle here a little bit. Some of this technology, this is a very large lettuce producer, hydroponic lettuce producer up in Quebec. But these are all ponds, and you can see that this is wall-to-wall heads of lettuce. The productivity, the yield per unit area per year is somewhere between 5 and 10 times what you get out in the open field in the best circumstances. They're grown on floating rafts. These are styrofoam rafts. This is a technology that was invented here. It's done on a very large scale. It's all mechanized, as you can see, and shipped all throughout the upper Northeast. Here's another example, and this is a greenhouse in California. This kind of greenhouse, the greenhouses here in the experimental facilities are quite close to this, but this is on a scale that is quite remarkable. It is a fairly enclosed green. It is almost sealed off, not completely, but the screens that you see on the side of the greenhouse exclude the insects. So insect control with insects themselves, insect predators, so biological control of insects is a very important aspect of this, decreasing chemical use. This particular greenhouse is also extremely efficient in water use. It recycles all of its water. It collects rainwater. Let's see if I have any more pictures. Yeah. And this is their rainwater catchment facility covered by photovoltaic panels, so they generate some of their electricity from the sun. They recirculate their water. Oops, how did that happen? And it's a pretty high-tech, high-intensity facility, which at the moment I think still holds the record for productivity, 100 kilograms of tomatoes per square meter per year, which is pretty good. So making this, again, this is an order of magnitude higher yield per unit area than you can get in an open field. So this kind of intensification has lots of room for advance. Again, this is something that's going on here, but this is a facility, an aquaponic facility in Quebec. Basically, they combine growing fish in tanks here. This is a bed that is full of bacteria that convert the ammonia that the fish give off to nitrates and then nitrates. And then the water is used as a source of fertilizer for the fish. So again, maximizing use of nutrients, minimizing the loss of water. Again, thinking about the whole thing as a system. And then I finally like to end with this. Oh, I'm sorry Mike isn't here. He really liked this. This is an urban farm. It's, at the moment, I think the largest urban farm. It's a 30,000 square foot greenhouse on a rooftop in Montreal. I'm happen to be very proud of it because my granddaughter and her boyfriend have put this together over the past 3 years. What I think is the most important aspect of this is that it's very high tech. Again, it's very conservative of water, very mindful of water quality, and minimal use of inputs, grows lovely vegetables. And what it does that I think is an extremely important thing for us to be mindful of is it brings agriculture back to the city. Part of my view is that part of the reason that agriculture gets the short end of the funding stick always is because we've separated. In the interests of efficiency, we've taken and put us in cities and agriculture elsewhere. I think this is important psychologically to bring it back, but it also brings the value of agriculture back to city dwellers. This happens to be the largest operation at the moment, but there are lots of big city projects. There have been rooftop greenhouses in New York for a long time. There are integrated aquaponic facilities being developed in London. Dr. Fitzsimmons probably has his finger in all these pies. Certainly in London, in New York, it's really something that is enormously attractive. People like it. One of the things that's very striking about the folks that work in this particular greenhouse is that they're all McGill graduates, and they're all doing this because they really believe in it. And I think that's a very important part of bringing agriculture back to people. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm delighted to answer any questions.
You might want to mention that McGill is the ag school
McGill is the ag school in Canada. Is it the only one? No, it can't be.
No, but it's Montreal, Ontario, or Quebec.
Quebec.
Questions, please. I'll pass this microphone around and speak directly into it, nice and clear. Thank you.
I'm sure you've heard all sorts of different types of questions for and against biologically modified organisms. But my question is, do you think that 25 years of studies and literature is enough to determine the effects of GMOs? And that's basically it.
That's a really interesting question. This is the first time we've ever asked people to study new varieties of crop plants for even a year, 5 years, okay? Crop development using chemical and radiation mutagenesis was what was done in the 20th century. We bombarded the genomes with chemicals. It was a shotgun approach. And then we planted them out, we looked for the good stuff, and we threw away the bad stuff. And crop development cycles were 10, 15 years, okay? And by the time the first genetically modified crop was on the market, it had gone through a good 15 years, because these techniques, the first genetically modified crops, were derived already 30 years ago. Yes, I think it's enough. If nothing has emerged in any crop that is an indicator that there's some special danger involved in using these methods, in 15 years of large-scale commercial operation and more than 30 years of scientific analysis, how long do we wait before we experience the benefits of it? Gosh.
Questions?
Thank you. That was hopeful. And my question is there something like a Fedoroff scale? In other words, with rank communities that are doing this well, because it's very inspirational. I had no idea that McGill was doing all of this.
McGill is not doing this. This is a private enterprise started by two young kids in their 20s, okay? My granddaughter and her Lebanese boyfriend. So he started a company. His family in Lebanon is in the greenhouse business. He said, I'm going to do it high tech, and I'm going to do it here, and I'm going to do it. So he invested. He did this himself.
Okay, so then maybe the question is, Money Magazine does a top 100 places to live every year based on certain values, small towns, livable. Is there something like that that shows which communities are leading the way in this type of approach?
There could be, but I don't know about it. But why not create it? What a great idea. What a great idea. I mean, the next step is going to be integrating what we do here, what's done here into the campus food service, perhaps. That's already being done at the University of California, Davis. So there's an organic farm on the campus, and the food goes directly into some of the food places, you know, the student union kind of place. So I think that's a great idea. I think it should be done in the middle of the city. I mean, Tucson is trying to renovate its face. So some of the kinds of ideas that you'll see on the internet, I don't think any of them are a reality yet, are just integrating the store with the greenhouse. So people can come in and pick their own produce. We do that on farms, or used to do it on farms.
One of the largest companies that feeds all of our young kids, not all, but Sodexo is a company that feeds many of our young people. It doesn't feed the University of Arizona, but many universities, NAU, many of the school districts are using Sodexo. Is starting to look at small greenhouse operations as part of their food supply. So I think we're moving in that direction.
Right.
So it's good to be bringing it in.
But I think that the idea of putting it in the middle of your town as a real attraction and as something that is particularly attractive, and why can't this be done on a small scale? You have a small growing facility at the South Pole. Why can't you do it in an apartment complex?
You can.
But you have to talk to the banker.
Well, that would be, and the developer. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
You started with talking about global warming, and there seems to be less argument about whether global warming is occurring as to whether it's human-caused or simply some long-term climatic cyclical event. Do you think there's any way to get people to throw out the argument of cause and just get to the dealing with the consequences? Because either way, we're going to be facing a warmer climate and the consequences of that, at least in maybe short term rather than longer term.
I think in that area and in GMOs, and there are many other examples like vaccination and so forth, I think there's a huge need to reframe the issue as opportunities and not oh my God, we got to do something, and then people are paralyzed and they stop believing in it because it's easier not to believe in it than to do something. So reframing it in a way that it presents an opportunity. I think that's easier done and is going on right now with climate change than even with GMOs, because the GMO mentality is really stuck. But there are a lot of big companies that are recognizing that they actually do have to do something, and that's where the opportunity lies.
Does GMO food, does it hurt, like, harm people in any way, or is it like?
Does it hurt what people?
Does it hurt people, like if we eat GMO food or food that has been genetically modified in some way? Is it going to harm us as a person?
No. It's probably the safest food that you can eat. And the reason it's the safest food that you can eat is because right now it is analyzed in ways that no other crop has ever been analyzed. Let me give you some examples from the past. Breeders breed for insect resistance, okay? And there are a couple of examples of insect resistance that was selected for without people worrying about whether it has an effect on people. So celery, for example, has a high content of something called sorolins, which are very irritating. You get skin rashes from them. They're cross-linking agents for DNA. And there were celery varieties released that were really high in sorolin, but the insects didn't like them either, okay, and they had to be pulled off the market. Another story is that a potato from my own university, Penn State, developed a potato many years ago called the linnate potato, and some observant agricultural extension agent boiled up a pot, ate some, potatoes and peas, and got sick, and did it again, did an experiment, got sick again. What they discovered was that in breeding for insect resistance, they had bred for an elevated glycoalkaloid content. Glycoalkaloids are produced in potatoes, and they're toxic, and that's what had happened. So they had to go back and pull it off the market because we didn't analyze. Today, the analytical tools are fantastically advanced from what they were even half a century ago. What you have to do to get a GM crop to the market is you have to show that that GM crop is the same except for that one trait that you added, and that there's no harm in the trait, either allergenicity or toxicity. So the bottom line is that crops modified by these modern techniques, which change a single gene or add a gene or modify a gene, are much safer. They create much less unknown damage. They're much more like genetically the crop that came from. And if you take a crop that you already know is safe and you add something that's safe, what do you get? Safe plus safe is, oops. You think it's going to be more damaging than something that came out of a field of mutagenized plants? I don't think so. I think that they're some of the safest crops that have, safest crop plants that have been introduced ever.
You mentioned eutrophication, and I didn't see much in the presentation about phosphorus and phosphorus utilization.
No, because there wasn't much.
But I was wondering if you could comment on that.
That's really part of the problem. So part of the larger problem. Also, a resource that people are beginning to acknowledge is fairly, it's finite, so it's now mined. And the question is, how do you design fertilizer application systems where you don't have so much runoff? And the example that I showed you with that fertigation system is one example.
So I
I think it'll take more monitoring, more sophisticated delivery systems.
So you see it as a fertilization issue, or also GMO? Would we be able to produce GMOs that better utilize the?
That's part of it. Probably more work is being done on nitrogen utilization. So plants, at best, if you give them unlimited amount of nitrogen, they take up just so much. So the question is increasing the ability of the plant to use it, take it up and use it. At the same time, decreasing the amount that you deliver and targeting. So there's a lot of opportunity there for research. We have formulations which are slow release for our potted plants. How do you create, large-scale systems? I gave you an example of one, that is doing it with liquid and integrating irrigation and watering, irrigation and fertilization. But that's not the only approach. The other approaches are how do you create new delivery systems.
Thank you.
Engineer, would you, Jim? Jim, would you?
Yes, I had a question on by putting toxins into the plant like this, what's the possibility of creating the superbug, like a person takes drugs for a certain time, they start becoming immune to it, you have to keep upping the level to become immune to it. And I'm just wondering if they put this into the plants, at what point where bugs or the things that they want to stop become immune to this, and they create a superbug, and now they have to create something else to get rid of it.
The answer to that is that you can't defeat nature forever. Organisms evolve. The way that the initial way that the industry went about minimizing the probability of developing resistance was to ask farmers to set aside a certain fraction of their land that's planted in non-GM varieties as a refuge for ordinary bugs that are not that would attack would be killed by the genetically modified crop. Actually, in fact, and surprisingly, the farmers were less observant of this refuge policy and so forth than you would expect, so there wasn't great compliance. And yet, to everyone's surprise, the development of resistance has been spotty and only in a few places. And a very well-known entomologist, when he went back and studied it, said, you know, if I'd said to people 7 years ago that this wasn't going to happen, they would have laughed me out of the room, but it hasn't. So it has not happened as fast as people anticipated, but what the industry has done is develop plants that have at least 2 genes. So if you have a low but finite probability, say 10 to the minus 6 of a single mutation, if you have to overcome 2 different resistances, it goes to 10 to the minus 12, it becomes vanishingly unlikely. So it's not like it isn't being addressed, but one can never say that it'll never happen. It has always happened. Insecticide-resistant bugs arise, herbicide-tolerant plants arise. That is just the nature of biology. So this is an ongoing challenge and has been forever.
Yeah, I've also read quite a bit about farmers that are growing their crops next to genetically modified fields, the pollen drift going into their farms and creating a problem with their crops, and they're wanting to save seed, which they cannot do at that point because then they're breaking some law, and it shut a lot of farms down because of the genetically modified drift going onto their farms. And I know that, you know, I guess Monsanto's the #1 in doing it, and they sue farmers for saying they've got, you know, they're using genetically modified crops, and they didn't want it in the first place, but it came from another farm. And so
you've mixed a lot of things together there. Which one do you want me to address?
Well, okay, the thing about the drift to farmers that do not want to grow. Okay,
and organic certification. The organic rule does not, it has provision for, pollen has always drifted, and that does not disqualify farmers from organic certification. Yes, they can keep their seeds, but for the most part, today, even organic farmers buy their seeds because there's a whole certification, you know, a disease-free, they do better with disease-free seeds and so forth and so on. As far as the Monsanto suing, I think the story that you're referring to is the Percy Schmeiser story, and that is a Canadian canola grower who suddenly had, I think it was canola, wasn't it? Did I get that wrong? Suddenly had fields and fields, straight rows of herbicide-tolerant canola. And it turns out that he was a bit of a shyster. He was going to go into business for himself. Monsanto does not have the money or the time or any reason to sue every small farmer that keeps a few seeds and plants them. This guy was going into business for himself, and they went through several court cases. Every court case they went through was resolved in favor of Monsanto because he was simply lying. He set out to steal that and go into business for himself. So what can I tell you? But now he's going around playing victim. Probably making more money than he did as a farmer.
Actually, my question I was going to ask was his tail-on question about Monsanto, and really whether truth or not, you know, there are lots of stories beyond
The Monsatan?
Yeah, demonizing Monsanto. And
I think you all know who I am by then.
Right. So it's just a question of where is that line between corporate stewardship, and I understand they make investments into this technology and should be compensated for it, but what do you sometimes feel, or I feel, or the perception of the public is that sometimes it's like some of these companies are trying to corner the market, like you know, the Hunt Brothers did with this, you know, trying to the silver market of saying, okay, I'm going to own this technology, and any producers will always have to go through me to plant crops in the future. That in the past was something that was very autonomous. A small farmer could own his or her own destiny themselves. So
That's a whole fascinating area, all right? And this is patent protection. I'd like to start by saying that it was Luther Burbank that was behind the first approval, the first Patent Plant Variety Protection Act. And he used to say, you know, any fool can patent a mousetrap or copyright a tune, but we breeders work for a lifetime, and anybody can steal our improved varieties. The whole principle of a patent is you have the right to commercialize in return for revealing to everybody what you did, so progress can go on and people can build on what you did. There was a time when we considered it a success when private industry took over from and commercialized something that came out of the publicly funded research community. Why we have decided that we have to demonize companies, which one forgets exist to make a profit for their shareholders. And if they don't make a profit, they cease to exist. Why we've decided that these guys are special demons, I'm not sure. That's a sociological question. But it's not a new one. If you go back to the origins, the first agricultural companies, I mean, the history goes way, way back to tulips and Holland and so forth. But in this country, it was Wallace that started the Pioneer Hybrid Company. And frankly, farmers had the same complaints. Gee, we like to save our seeds. We don't want to be beholden to companies, blah, 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 blah. When I was writing my book, I was in correspondence with Don Duvik, who was the chief breeder for Pioneer Hybrid. And he said, you know, I grew up on a farm in, I've forgotten, somewhere in the Midwest. And, you know, my dad, the year of the 1936 drought or whatever it was, the only thing that was worth bringing in was the hybrid corn. And after that, all the farmers planted hybrids. And they bought their hybrids, because hybrids you have to buy. But his dad was kind of curious. He said, I want to see if the professors are right. Can't I keep this seed? So he planted out his seed. And if you know the biology of hybrid vigor, you know that he got a mess. And the conclusion was that the professors were right. And that's kind of where the transition to commercial growers started. Now, what do companies do? They do all the hybridization. They give you good seed, and you pay for it, and you profit by increased profit margins. But that continues today. And Monsanto would stop existing if it didn't provide value to the farmers, right? They wouldn't buy it. They'd buy something else. So why do we vilify them? And by the way, you know, yep, sure. We can wrap up immediately. No. Monsanto, among the companies, is one of the most generous of them. It set up the African Technology Foundation. It has donated a lot of intellectual property. There's a high carotene maize that is being developed in Africa. They are part of a huge consortium that is seeking to create a drought-tolerant maize for Africa. Amongst those companies, it's probably done more and gotten the worst reputation. So it's really quite paradoxical. And no, I don't take any money. I've never had any money from Monsanto.
Well, maybe on that note, we'll come to a conclusion here. I would like to think that we don't end on that note. We end on a positive, because you did go through your analysis and end with what can we do?
Yes, to
what
intensify
should we do?
and be more intelligent about agriculture.
Exactly. And I think I heard, and I hope, education was a big, big part of that, getting information out there. And we're glad to
Becoming
help.
better
If there's some way
sales.
we can continue to help.
Yeah, becoming better salespeople for what we do and what we contribute.
Very good. Let's thank Nina and